Welcome to the Moms of Tweens and Teens podcast. If some days you doubt yourself and you don't know what you're doing, if you've ugly cried alone in your bedroom because you felt like you're failing, well, I just want you to know you're not alone and you have come to the right place. Raising tweens and teens in today's world is not easy. And I'm on a mission to equip you to love well and to raise emotionally healthy, happy tweens and teens that thrive. I believe that moms are heroes and we have the power to transform our family and to impact future generations. If you are looking for answers, encouragement, and to become more of the mom and the woman that you want to be, welcome. I'm Cheryl Gould, and I am so glad that you're here. Hi, friend. Welcome to the show today. And in this episode, we're getting raw, we're getting real. We're talking about rising above our stories. And we have all experienced pain and trauma, whether it be little t trauma or big T trauma. We have all had people or events or situations that have hurt and wounded us. And I know for myself that until I dealt with the pain and trauma of losing my dad at 10 years old in a car accident and really dealing with that pain and that trauma, and I didn't do it until I was in my early 40s, it was really difficult for me to truly know who I was, for me to be able to experience all of my emotions. I thought that if I started talking about my pain and the trauma that I experienced, that I would just like curl up in a ball and I wouldn't be able to cope. And it was so not true. It wasn't until I really dealt with my pain and my hurt and my trauma that I truly experienced abundant life, freedom, peace. Not that it is perfect by any means, but I really experienced so much healing. And in today's interview, I am honored to welcome Karena Killcoin, and she is a best-selling author of Rise Above the Story. And in this interview, Karena shares her story of trauma and her journey to healing. And she also inspires all of us to rise above our stories and take the courageous path to really finding ourselves, who we truly are, and finding that peace and achieving emotional freedom. So I can't wait for you to listen. Let's dive in. Well, welcome, Karena, to the show. And I'm so grateful that you're here and really excited to talk to you.
Oh, thank you, Cheryl, for having me. I'm really excited to be here as well.
Well, congratulations. Your book, Rise Above the Story, hit the USA Today bestseller list, and also came in at number 5 on Publishers Weekly's hardcover nonfiction bestseller list. I was looking at you on Instagram. You've been on the Today Show. And what has it been like to write this book and just be having it be so well received?
I have to tell you, I've been working on this book for a long time. I've been on this journey of healing and research and writing and rewriting for about 7-8 years now. And I knew it was a powerful message, and I knew it was something that people really needed. But I have been completely blown away by the reception of it and how many people are resonating with it. And I went on a almost 2-week book tour around the book launch at the end of January. And I went across the country. I was in Los Angeles, New York, places in between, Columbus, Ohio, all over Florida. And I have to tell you, what I enjoyed so much was talking to all these people I would stand up and I would talk about what the book's about. And I would share my own stories of trauma, my very traumatic childhood. And I would talk about all of that. And afterward, people would come up to me and they would want to tell me their story.
Mm.
And it was so surprising to me, too, that I thought it would be so much women. They say women buy the majority of books, women are, majority of readers. And I have to tell you, though, I had a fair amount of men who wanted to come up and share their stories of trauma and things that had happened to them that they don't openly talk about, that now they want to talk about. So it has been an exciting and deeply rewarding journey that I've been on now that this book has been released.
I just think about what you said, like that you shared you've been so raw and real in your book and sharing growing up in a violent home and growing up with a mom that had mental health issues, and sharing that other people, they want to talk about it, but yet we often are so afraid to. And share a little bit about your story for our listeners and what gave you the courage to start talking about your own trauma.
As you said, I had a very traumatic and challenging childhood. My parents were quite violent with each other. I witnessed domestic violence regularly. And my mother definitely had mental health challenges and issues. And, back then it was the 70s, early 80s, and that wasn't really something, especially in kind of my socioeconomic class, something that people didn't go to therapy and they weren't really diagnosed. But knowing what I know now, I would say she suffered from depression, anxiety, and probably some manic episodes.
Mm-hmm.
And my father went to prison. We started having legal troubles when I was about 11. And the FBI would be surveilling our house and looking for my father. And when I was about 12, he went to prison. He went to the federal penitentiary. He was sentenced. And he left us some money. My father had been a hardworking businessman, and he went to the federal penitentiary for financial crimes, fraud. But when he left us some money. My mother did not handle it well, nor did she handle the stress of being left with 3 children. And so we quickly went through the money, and my mother was despondent. She would lay in bed for days at a time, days, sometimes almost a week at a time. We didn't have money for food. I would ask strangers for money to buy, cans of soup or a pack of American cheese or a loaf of bread. And we would often go without electricity or hot water. I remember, trying to make a bath up out of some kind of tepid water any way I could so that we all could take a bath. And it was really, really traumatizing. And when I was 14, my mother had my last brother, my youngest brother. And so we were 9 years apart. We're 14 years apart. And when he was 9 and I was 24, our mother died of cancer.
Mm.
And so I had this traumatic childhood, and I knew that education was my way out. So I put myself through college and law school. And as I was finishing up my 3rd year of law school, my mother died of cancer. And there was nobody to raise my youngest brother, who was only 9 at the time. So I adopted him. And I took all that trauma that I had experienced and did not process from childhood. I didn't know how to do that. And most children don't know how to do that. Your brain's not fully developed to know how to process trauma. And I did not have parents who knew how to do that for me, to teach me how to process the trauma or see that I got help for it. And so I carried all that unprocessed trauma right into adulthood. And I stayed in survival mode for decades.
And what was that like for you? What were you experiencing? What was the cost? Because to the outward eye, here you were very successful. You are a criminal defense attorney.
Mm-hmm.
And were things starting to crumble? What was happening, holding all that in?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question. So the the trickle down effect of trauma is resounding, really. I mean, I said trickle down, but actually it felt so much like, in so many ways, it was like somebody had turned the faucet on of depression and anxiety. And I was just living like that day to day. But I had this self-imposed structure, probably some sort of resilience, where I was trying to hold it all together. So I believed falsely that if I succeeded, that if I did enough hard work, if I succeeded, if I was a good lawyer, if I had the right clients, if I did the right things, that somehow I would feel better about myself, that all of that hurt and all that anguish and all that depression would go away. And it didn't. And in fact, it showed up so in so many ways in my life. So personally, it showed up where I always felt unworthy of relationships I was in. And I was terribly afraid of being abandoned. That was my big story for my whole childhood, right? I was abandoned by my father who went to prison. I was abandoned by my mother who was in the same house, but unable to care for me physically, emotionally, mentally. And so I carried these stories of abandonment into adulthood. And I chose friends and lovers and boyfriends and even my first husband out of some sense of, I didn't want to be alone. I was terrified. I was scared. Like I didn't want to do that. So I chose bad things for me personally. Professionally, I kept riding this wave of success, but feeling completely exhausted. And like I was an imposter the whole time. Like nobody can find out all these stories about me. And if they do, what will they think? And I remember being a young attorney and having a judge ask me if I was the daughter of the felon in the 80s who rolled back odometers. And I remember feeling so mortified, like, oh my gosh, like he knows this, like everybody else is going to know this. And carrying that stigma of being a felon's daughter impacted me profoundly in so many aspects of my life. And so I carried all of that with me. And then you asked about, were things crumbling? I was on the inside little by little. And so I would dabble in therapy over the years. I would say, a little while after my mother died, I had a whole instance where like, oh, I can't get out of bed. I'm so exhausted. I can't go to work. I can't show up. I went to therapy then. And it was interesting. I remember going to therapy and talking about, oh, I'm sad because my mother died. I never disclosed to her that my mother was abusive or that my mother was chained to her bed and with depression or that we went without food. I danced around the idea like, well, I'm here to make me feel better, but I'm not going to really tell you what's going on with me. I wasn't ready to bring it up to the surface. And I did that a few times throughout my life. And in my 30s, I had a really bad breakup. After my first divorce, I had a really toxic relationship and a really bad breakup. And I went to some therapy for that. But again, it was like, oh, here I am. I was in a bad relationship, right? I wasn't getting into like the deep, dark. I'd say, well, I have these memories about my parents. Just make them stop. I need to get on with my life. I wouldn't really talk about it. And so it wasn't until, later on and I had something really significant happen, a significant loss that I was really then ready to do the real work. But I think so many of us out there feel that sense of like something's crumbling around me or inside me, or this isn't right. And you dabble in therapy, but you don't really know what to say, or you don't feel safe talking about things. And that was an important part for me with this book is I wanted to create a guidebook for people. I wanted to take away that overwhelm. And one of the best things I've heard from people who've read this book is they say, I've read the book and I've done the exercises, and now I know what I want to talk to my therapist about.
Wow. How
Yeah. And
cool is
isn't
that?
that powerful? I love that. I love that because like I said, I think I'm not the only one probably who has gone to therapy, but not really done the work, to have really effective therapy.
Yeah, going a little bit deeper, that you're just living
Yes.
on the surface. I was
Mhm.
like that. I would go to therapy and then they would say something to me and I would blow out. I was like, just not go anymore. And you have to go deeper, and that can be so scary to really dig in. What do you think
Mhm.
What do you think your resistance was to going deeper? Do you think you knew at the time that you needed to go deeper? Or do you think, because part of me, I think, didn't even know. I was so used to living on the surface that, and getting along,
Mhm.
that I could talk myself out of things. What do you think it was like for you?
Yes, I see that. I agree with that. I would say there was some of that for me. I was so used to, even as a child, I was programmed to keep things in a box, to keep things lined up, to make sure
Mhm.
everything was okay, right? I was just built that way. I was built to make sure that it looked like everything was structured and okay, even though it wasn't. So there was part of me that was such a default setting that it was hard for me to break that down and really expose the truth. But then I think the other part for me was I was terrified to bring up
Mhm.
the depth and cruelty of what happened to me. I was
Mhm.
terrified to relive it. I didn't want to bring it up. And I
Mhm.
think that that's a lot of what people
Mhm.
experience is they feel like, oh, I'm just going to pack this down. I'm going to pack it down. It's going to go away. Eventually, it can't stay there forever, right? It'll go away. And that's what I thought. And it doesn't go away. And as sure as I'm sitting here talking to you, I'm going to tell everybody who can listen, who can hear me, that emotions are energy. And actually, the word emotion comes from a Latin derivative that means move through, release. You're
Mhm.
not meant to pack stuff, compartmentalize your emotions. Your part of the human experience is to be here to feel them, to feel every part of them, the good ones, the bad ones, the grief, the joy, the whatever. That's part of why we're here, and honor them and release them. But so many of us pack it down and then we're too afraid to let it unearth. And what happens to us physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, when we do that, it's really profound and it starts to eat away at you little by little. And you're like, oh, I gotta go to therapy, maybe this. But if you don't effectively address it, it really can cause some real issues.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and just walking around kind of feeling like dead, and just numbed down, shut
Mm-hmm.
down to all of the emotions. If we shut one
Yes.
down, then we're shutting them all down. And I remember when I first really started feeling my feelings, I started laughing so much more.
Mm-hmm.
And I was amazed by that. What do you think were when you said you were terrified, what would happen if you started talking about it? What did you think would happen if you started talking about it?
I didn't know who I really was.
Mm.
I had no idea who I really was. I only knew this construct of who I thought I was. The people pleaser, the one who learned at 5 years old, oh, if I do cartwheels and recite Shel Silverstein poems, my mom will smile or laugh or whatever, right? So it's like I never really knew who I was. And I was afraid of that. I was afraid of, well, who am I without all of this? It becomes so much a part, your story becomes so much a part of who you believe you are, that it's scary to think, even as bad as that is, right? Even as bad as you feel and traumatized and depressed and anxious as you feel, for so many of us, there's an addiction to that happens. It's like, well, that's more comfortable than the unknown, right? I'd rather sit in this and what I do know than go to the unknown place and feel like, well, I'm basically, am I starting over? Like, who am I without all that? And it's can be really scary and overwhelming because you don't really know how to unpack it and what to do with it. It's not like, oh, I'm going to go to therapy 3.5 hours and it's going to come out and I'm going to be like, boom, I'm better, right? That's not how it works. So I feel like there's so much of an unknown
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that's what scared me. And And I sense that that's what scares a lot of people. You spend a lot of time constructing like who you want to be in the world or who you think you are because of what happened to you. And then you're like, whoa, what do you want me to do? Let all that go and start over again?
Yeah. Or what's going to be, who will I be and what's going to be left? Maybe there'll be nothing there if I
Mm-hmm.
let go of this.
Right.
It's scary. And I was thinking as you were talking, like those were coping mechanisms that worked for you.
Mm-hmm.
They
Absolutely.
work for long enough until they don't work.
Right.
And, and so it was so familiar to you to be achieving and performing and doing and on that hamster wheel that now what do I do?
Right.
I let
You know,
go of
and I think there's like this array, right, of what could happen to you when you experience trauma. How do you respond to it? So there's this faction of us who, fall into addiction, or we can't succeed, or we think we can't succeed, or we're stuck and we feel like, oh, everything bad happens to me, oh, woe is me, right? There's like that faction of people, and
Mhm.
then there's this other faction that thinks, oh, I'm going to go out and kick the world's butt and succeed and do everything I can and have all the best things, and that's going to make me better. And there's various degrees in between all that, of course, but those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum. And it's interesting that even when you're in that second camp, like I was, of like, oh, I'm going to do all this, I'm going to succeed, you still get back to the point where nothing matters. Like you're just as empty as if you had nothing anyway. I was just as empty in those days having success in a nice car and going on nice vacations. I was just as empty and exhausted then as I was, at 17 years old, trying to deal with my trauma and not knowing what to do about it except to pack it down. So it's like, while you may respond to your trauma in different ways, the essence of what's happening to you is all very similar. And I think that's kind of, if there is any one through line in this, it's that no matter what we're doing to as a reaction to it, whether we're numbing out, like you said, which I love that example because so many of us do that. I spent time doing that, like numbing out everything.
Yeah.
If you're an addict, if you're addicted to success, like whatever it is, the through line is still this idea of nothing feels right. Nothing feels like it's worth anything. Nothing feels exciting and bright and joyful. So there's still that through line for us all of what we need to get to and what we're worthy of. And that's the thing too. I think so many of us don't understand and believe that we're worthy of joy and laughter, like you were talking about, like laughing more. Like I remember that too. I just got a chill saying that. I remember when I started to go through like healing and I would start laughing more and I'd think, oh my God, like this is amazing. Like things are funny. It's
Yeah,
just
I
a
know.
great
It's like,
thing.
yeah, I didn't fall into the pit like I thought I might. I thought I might never get out. But
Yeah.
here I am and I'm actually laughing. It's very
Mm-hmm.
counterintuitive. So,
Yeah.
so you had something happen and then you got into therapy, I'm imagining, and started working on your wounds and started laughing and finding
Mm-hmm.
some freedom. And how long until you said it took about 8 years? What made you decide to start writing this book? And how did things begin to change for you?
So I had always wanted to be a writer since I was, I don't know, 5, 6 years old. I'm not sure I understood the concept of writing as much as I just understood I wanted to write stories that made people laugh or whatever. I loved books. But I will say that just to kind of give the full colored picture of my healing journey, I had this beloved dog named Finn. And I didn't know it when I got him. He's a golden retriever, but he became an emotional support dog for me, which I think a lot of dogs are. They just, you don't call them that, but like dogs are always kind of emotional support dogs. But he was just truly like one of my first experiences with unconditional love. I had never, ever experienced that. And I was even married for the second time to my current husband, and I would not allow myself to feel like this deep sense of unconditional love or connection to him because I hadn't been through my healing journey yet. But with my sweet Finn, it was like I had these moments of no matter how I felt or what I was, I felt like he loved me unconditionally. He got very sick when he was young and he died of cancer. And it gutted me. I was not expecting it. I didn't know what I was going to do without him. It was this loss that I could not explain or deal with properly. And I just cried and cried and grieved. And after about a week or 10 days, I started to think, God, something's really wrong with me. Like, I understand I miss my dog, but like that it just wouldn't stop. And I started to realize that Finn had gotten sick and was going through the last phases of his life, almost 20 years to the exact time of my mom going through her last phase and dying of cancer. So all these memories of my mother and our terrible relationship, and even on her deathbed, me not, getting any kind of real processing of anything from her, any kind of apology from her, and me carrying around all this resentment and anger, it all just flooded through me. And I started to grieve her and my father and my lost childhood. And I thought, I am ready. Like it's all coming out now, whether I want it to or not. Like, it's just like the floodgates opened or something. So I started going to therapy, but more than that, I took all my type A personality and all my drive, and I thought, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it right. So I went here, there, and everywhere trying to heal myself. I did traditional therapy. I did holotropic breath work. I did all kinds of things. And I write about them all in the book. But when I got to the other side of healing, and that was, a few years of that for me, of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps up, 2 steps back. It was like, this constant kind of give and take of healing. And it was overwhelming. And I read a lot of books and I did a lot of things and I saw a lot of different kind of therapists. And when I got to the other side, I realized that I felt so empowered. And I finally felt confident to pursue my childhood dream of writing. And I knew exactly what I wanted to write about because I knew that what I wanted to take away that sense of overwhelm I felt. And I wanted to create a roadmap or a guidebook or something where people felt like, oh, I get this. I follow these steps. I kind of do these things. And I really thought about what were my seismic shifts, what helped me the most. What did I learn that really flipped my brain open? What lit me up? Like what did I understand through everything I learned? And I wanted to put it all in a format, in a very simple, approachable, accessible format for people. And I have to tell you, one of the earliest things that I felt and I later learned was that I wasn't alone in my trauma or my storytelling. In fact, 70% of us will experience trauma in our lifetime. 70%, and that's the National Council for Mental Wellbeing statistic. And I think that people don't get that. So you started this conversation with us out, and you said something that made me think about that, so many of us don't want to talk about it. And I think it's because we feel like we're different.
Yes.
I don't want to talk about that. Like, who wants to hear my sad story about, the fact that I was abused or, whatever, or that my parents, did, or somebody had a drug problem. Like, they think that they're so alone and they're not. And I think that is one thing that I wanted to come out of this more than anything else, is for people to know that you're not alone. 70% of us, and I bet you it's even more of us, honestly, because they're going off people who report this, and there are people who don't even report it. So I bet you it's more than 70%. Yeah. So I think that what goes on is people think that they're alone. They don't want to talk about it because of that, and they feel a certain amount of shame about it.
I agree. And I feel like when I started my journey of healing, I was amazed. That was I'm so glad you said that, because that was the biggest thing that struck me. And being in a group where people were working on things, that people had gone through things that I had gone through. And I was like, wow, I did just think that it was me. And then all these other people, like the men that were coming up to you, not just the women, the men coming up and sharing their story, that you, by writing this book, are letting them know you're not alone. And so then they feel the safety and freedom to come up and share it with you because you understand. You've
Yes.
been there and how you're just opening up that path for somebody else, and how beautiful that people are also reading it and then using it with their therapist because it gives them a guide that helps them to know, where do I want to go with this? Because I don't think that people always talk about their trauma. It's kind of like we were talking about, work on the surface so that you're helping people to dig deeper. So I just want to talk a little bit about, you give a framework in the book. And I would like the listeners, I know so many moms are listening to this and they're like, oh my gosh, I need this. Nobody talks about this, very few people. What are just a few things that you share in the book? I don't want you to share all of it. I want them to get your book. And of course, you can't share all of it. But what are a few things that you share?
So I share a 3-step formula. And again, I base it off of really what helped me the most. What were my seismic shifts about what I learned? And the first one for me was acknowledging my story. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. You're saying, maybe sometimes people don't really know that, what they're living in or whatever. And you're so right. So it's this idea of, first of all, you have to be in a space where you do see it and you want to heal. It's just like anything. It's like addiction. You do an intervention and all these things. You can't force somebody into treatment. You can suggest, you can offer love. It's the same thing. I feel like when you want to heal from your trauma, you have to want to do it. You have to be in a space you're like, I'm ready. And even though it's going to be hard and it might be a little back and forth and give and take, I still want to. So the first step is acknowledging the story. And I talk a lot about in the book, and I give some examples from my legal career, just about, how you look at your trauma objectively about what happened to you. It's just factual what happened. And then there's the subjective nature of what your brain created as a story for you. So your brain wants to keep you safe in a space of trauma. It wants you to know that if you don't process the emotions around the trauma, your brain will continue to think you're in fight or flight, like something's happening, you're in danger. So it writes a story to keep you safe. Usually that story is one of unworthiness. I'm unlovable. I'm not worthy of this. I'm, whatever you name it, and so what you want to do is acknowledge the fact that something happened to you, your trauma, and that your brain wrote a false story because of it. So for instance, I would say in the book, mine is this: it's because my father went to prison, factual. I wrote the false story about myself that no one would ever love me and I would always be abandoned. So there's this idea of just acknowledging what story you're living in. Second step is it's a lot of work, and it's the deep work. And for me, it included inner child work, going back and really healing that stuff that happened to me when I was a child and processing it all and forgiving others, forgiving my parents and understanding that they had a story, and finding compassion, empathy for them, and also understanding that forgiveness is not about them. It's about me and me not carrying around that grudge. And a big one here that I think applies a lot to your listeners is, I talk a lot about in the step about figuring out how you got so entangled in a story. And one of the ways that happens is the multi-generational transfer of trauma. So, we were talking about this before we started recording, and that's, this idea that we don't even know sometimes that we're passing down our story or our negative beliefs about ourselves. Or the fact is, I feel like, especially as mothers, like we do so much for everyone else and we sacrifice our own wholeness or our own peace of mind or our own love for ourselves. And it's one thing to be that generous, but it also, you're showing your children that you're not valuing yourself or your own wholeness or your own, so I think that there's an important factor of that, understanding the generational trauma that your family's experienced. Then the third step is rising above your story. And that's about finding gratitude in everything that's happened And the big one and most difficult one for me was finding authentic self love,
Mm,
because it is impossible to heal from trauma and stay in that space if you have an emotional tsunami raging inside of you. And a lot of that is because we don't love ourselves.
yeah.
Just don't. We're taught love everyone else, show empathy and compassion for everyone else. But how often are we taught or encouraged or nurtured to do that for ourselves? So, as children of trauma, we're not always taught that. And so, learning it later in life is crucial. And that's a big part of the book is tapping in and some exercises on how to find that real authentic self-love.
Yeah. How has your life changed? When you said you were laughing again, uh, you also mentioned that you married your husband before you were doing the work. And I was curious, oh, I wonder how that your relationship with your husband has grown since you started doing this.
Mm. I can't say enough about my husband. I did an amazing job. I'm shocked when I look back at it, like who I was when I met him and chose him and had a relationship with him. I'm shocked because I was not in this healing, happy place. And so, typically when you're not in that space, you don't choose the best person. But
Yeah.
I did. And he is so full of unconditional love, and he's kind, and he's a big kid. And I think that's what I loved about him, was that I was so caught up in my serious, got to keep a construct, got to be this way. And everything is fun and silly. And I love that about him. So that to me he's been a godsend. And he was there with me every step of the way. And every time I'd go to something that would work or didn't work, I'd come home and tell him all about it. So that's been wonderful. I would say the biggest ways though that I have shifted are that, we talked about me sharing so vulnerably these stories in my book. And I share them, and people say, aren't you scared to talk about that? Weren't you scared to write that? Or when I go out and talk about my book, aren't you scared to talk about that? And I'd say, no, I'm not, because I'm no longer emotionally tethered to those stories. I am sharing those stories to be of service. I no longer get an emotional charge from those stories. I have done the work. I have forgiven my parents. I understand where they are in the world. I understand where they were in the world then. It's not ideal. It wasn't ideal. It'll never be ideal. But I am blessed to be where I am now. I wouldn't be the person I am had I not found a way to survive all of that. So I love that. I have found emotional freedom
Mhm.
from the past. And I don't get caught up in things like that anymore. And then again, this just deep well of self-love. My default setting of my brain is now not, oh, you're unworthy, or I hate myself. My default setting is, I love myself. I'm so proud of myself. And and I want people to get there too, because it is such a beautiful place to be. Do I still say negative things about myself? Of course. But I
Yeah.
have the awareness now to stop myself and say, why are you saying that? That is so not the truth. Look at da 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 da. So I have learned to develop and work on a relationship with myself, which is just as much work as having a relationship with anybody else. So it's important to know that.
Yeah. Which goes back, excuse me, to your first point about understanding, like acknowledging your story. There's
Mhm.
such a big piece of that is acknowledging your story in order to really be able to heal. And the more that, because I feel like it's easy when you've gone through trauma to just be detached from it
Mhm.
and not look at it. But then once you look at it, then because of the healing, it doesn't have the power over you anymore. And then you
Absolutely.
can talk about it, but it's not because you're detached from it anymore. You've just healed it. There's a difference.
Right.
What I'm talking about, like it feels very different. Like I
Yes.
used to be able to tell my story with no emotion. People would be like, it wouldn't match because I'd shut down around it. But then once I
Mhm.
started talking about it, I had to feel it and go through it. And then I was able to share my story without all the, being so attached to it, having it impact it's a story of my life, but I'm not letting it define any longer who I am.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's actually a really wise distinction that you're making. And I would say too, if I could add to it, from my perspective, a lot of it shifted for me as well, because I shifted out of a victim mindset. So I was for so long in that space of, oh, when I would talk about it, or everyone talk about it, yeah, like, oh, woe is me. Like, right. Like this happened to me and I was abused and blah, blah, blah. And it felt very like, there was no real emotion attached to it, because I was trying to detach from it. But it was also this sense of, um, emotional entitlement. Like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, like I'm entitled to feel this way. I'm entitled to be royally, ticked off about what happened to me. I'm entitled to that. And so that, coming from that space, is a lot different, to your point. So part of my healing, and one of the things I like to encourage people, is to look at that. Are you coming from a victim mindset? And listen, I'm somebody who has endured physical abuse, and I understand that. And I was a criminal defense lawyer, so I'm going to say this: that in any moment in time, something happens to you. In that moment in time, there is a perpetrator and there is a victim. And if you endured that abuse, or that crime was committed upon you, you are indeed in that moment a victim. But from that moment on, you get to choose
Yes.
whether or not you carry that title anymore. And so I write about my experience in that in the book, and how I had a wonderful mentor who taught me that, about around this idea of my father being a felon and me carrying this around as a young lawyer, and da, da, da. And she'd say, you have to get over that. Like, you're making yourself a victim over it. You don't need to do that. And when that light bulb finally went on about everything I had endured, that I could choose not to be a victim anymore, things shifted, as you were talking about just a few minutes ago, that then I could talk about things from the other side, like objectively, like, yes, these things happened to me. And in the moment I felt like this, but right now I have no emotional attachment to it, because I've processed it and I've let go my victim mentality about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a huge piece of it, letting go of that victimhood.
Yeah.
And I like that. I have never heard that before. What did you say? Something entitlement?
Oh, emotional entitlement.
Yes, emotional entitlement. We feel entitled to feel that way because we've
Mhm.
been wronged. And yes, we have, but that we get to choose what we're going to do with it and how we're going to
Yeah.
move. So I'm so grateful that you've written this book, that you're using your story. Have you ever heard the term wounded healer?
Yes.
I love that. And I
Mhm.
think it was Henry Nouwen that came up with that. But I love, that you're using what you've gone through and sharing it so others can have healing in their lives. And so tell everybody, like, where can they get your book? It's out there where all books are sold, and what you're up to, what you're doing. I would love for them to be able to find you.
So I have a website, riseabovethestory.com, the same as the book, riseabovethestory.com. I am on social media, on Instagram at Karena_Killcoin. I'm trying to get on a speaker circuit. So I have been doing some interviews and putting the word out, because I want to spread this message far and wide. So I'm doing a lot of these podcasts, so wonderful ones like yours with great reach. And, I just really want to get the word out. This to me is just such a passion project. And I spent a lot of time doing it. And I've spent a lot of time making sure that what I'm putting out there is simple and accessible and helpful. And I love nothing more than going out and meeting people IRL in real life, telling me their stories and like relating and giving a hug and saying, you got this. Like, we're all in this together. There's not so few of us, are going to go through our lives unscathed. So I'm so grateful to you and for all you're doing to helping people. And thank you for having me on. It's been wonderful.
Oh, it's been such a wonderful conversation. And I just want to say the moms, I heard this explained and I thought it was a good way to explain it. There's little T trauma and there's big T trauma, right? But we all on some level have it. And I just feel like there's no greater work we can do than the work that you're doing. And that's what I'm always wanting to do with my moms, because we heal from the inside out. And it affects, it's like a wind chime. You're doing your work, then, it affects everybody else, that our children, our spouses, our partners, our families, and most of all ourselves. So really important work. And thank you so much for being here, Karena.
Thank you, Cheryl, for having me.
Well, that's it for today. And thank you so much, friend, for joining me. And I want you to know that we now have an amazing resources page. There's resources for free. There's courses and workshops. There's affirmations, movie lists, family fun ideas, things to do for the summer, conversation scripts, workshops on boundaries and setting limits that work with your tweens and teens. And there is a Raising Teenagers course right now that's normally $197, that's now discounted to $97. It's called Raising a Teenager, Decoding and Reconnecting. And you can find all of this on Moms of Tweens and Teens Resources.com. So go to the new page and scroll down to the bottom and you will find all our amazing content, which I am adding to weekly to support you. So thank you so much for being with me. I'm so grateful for you, and I will see you back here next week. Have a good one.